As you're playing your adventures, especially if you have a base of operations, your reputation as a party can really affect how everyone around you and how people in that particular base of operations interact with you. Pathfinder has a very good system for reputation, and I think of all the optional subsystems, it is probably one of the easiest and maybe the one that makes the most sense to implement in quite a few campaigns. My name is Don. I'm trying to be the Sly Strategist, and let's go ahead and get into it. Now, your reputation as a party is a pretty interesting concept when you're dealing with like a long-term campaign. This particular concept of reputation involves the accumulation or potentially reduction of reputation points by the player characters over a medium or moderate to a long period of time. It will occur within a specific group of individuals, such as a guild, a government, a church, village, trade association, could potentially be a party you're working against, or another group of NPC player characters that might be in the same village or the same situation that you are at that time. Player characters can increase their reputation points by carrying out helpful actions for the organization up to a maximum of 50 reputation points. On the other side of it, you can also decrease those reputation points by performing harmful deeds with a minimum limit of negative 50 reputation points. Now, as you go through these levels of reputation points, there are different things and different categories that you would go through that would determine how these other organizations would interact with you. And let's go ahead and kind of get into a little bit more detail on those things. So there are two things that you can do in order to affect your reputation points. You can carry out favors on behalf of a particular group, or you can provoke, anger, or frustrate a group, thereby giving you negative points. So let's go ahead and start with the carrying out of favors. The favors can generally be categorized as follows. So these would be, you could start with minor favors. Minor favors, pretty straightforward and basic tasks that don't demand too much effort from the player character or take up a significant amount of time during gameplay. If you perform one of these minor favors, you will basically get 1 reputation point for your group. Moderate favors require a lot more effort. You could consider it a substantial amount of effort and will consume possibly an entire session or at least a noticeable portion of a single session to complete. Undertaking a moderate favor rewards the player characters with 2 points. And then there would be major favors. These involve a significant undertaking, often spanning an entire quest line and requires multiple sessions to complete. I wouldn't necessarily say that it has to totally encompass multiple sessions, but in order to achieve this major favor should take a significant amount of thought and working during these sessions in order to basically gain these points. Major favors will yield 5 reputation points. Now, on the other side, there are disservices. Now, disservices encompass a wide range of actions that can provoke, anger, or frustrate a group. And if you've been through a couple campaigns, you know people can take umbrage at various things. So whether due to deliberate malice and maybe premeditation on the part of the player characters, or just accidentally doing something that is going to anger a particular group, you can get negative reputation points or reduce your reputation point total. Unlike favors, disservices don't have a direct correlation with in-game time. Even a swift yet exceptionally severe action can qualify as a major disservice. So these wouldn't necessarily have to have multiple sessions dedicated to doing something bad. You could just do something horrible at the drop of a hat, and that would be considered a major disservice. Disservices will result in the loss of reputation points for the party characters. And there are basically the 3 categories just with disservices that there was on the other side. Minor disservices are small yet significant missteps or the accumulation of a bunch of minor offenses and inconveniences. Minor disservices will deduct 1 reputation point from the player characters. Moderate disservices go beyond mere nuisances and annoyances, and they are generally going to involve actions that significantly hinder the group's efforts or violate maybe a fundamental belief of the group. Let's say that you are talking about a church and you do something that is an anathema to their beliefs, then that would be a moderate disservice at the very least. And kind of the limit here is going to be it can't be too egregiously severe. So if you did something that you brought a book into a church that talked about undead and it was an anathema in order to do anything for the undead to that particular church, that might be a moderate. However, if you raised an undead in the church itself, then that would probably qualify to the next category. Moderate disservices will subtract 2 reputation points. And then major disservices, these represent actions that are highly antagonistic towards a group. Once again, actually raising a dead in a church itself that is purely an anathema to their beliefs. It often involves a single audacious act, such as thwarting a cabal's cataclysmic doomsday plan, ruining the reputation of a kingdom, something major that would cause problems. So major disservices result in a loss of at least 5 reputation points and potentially more if the action that you did was just particularly severe. They could be so abhorrent that the PCs instantly lose all reputation points and further lose 5 additional reputation points in addition to that. So you could really, really tank your reputation just by doing a major disservice. And once again, unlike favors, these do not require time. This could happen at the drop of a hat if you do the wrong thing specifically on purpose for major disservice, but even something minor that you do just without thinking can also be classified as a disservice. Now that we've talked a little bit about what favors are and what disservices are, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the different reputation categories. So when we're talking about reputation for the player characters, by default, the characters are generally going to be ignored reputation among most groups. And you can think of it this way. If you go in your real life to a supermarket and you see someone else in the same aisle that you're going to, you don't have an opinion on that person one way or the other. You generally aren't going to even, you might wave to them, but generally speaking, you aren't going to get into a long conversation with them simply because they happen to be in the same aisle you are, even though you've never seen them before in your life. At this point, you would kind of consider that ignored. In other words, you'll try and move around them. You'll maybe won't potentially try to hinder them in any particular way. However, they don't really fit into what you are there to do, nor are you going to take any time with them. If the PCs have gained significant fame or notoriety within related groups, you can start with a different reputation depending on what you have done with the affiliated groups. And it's important to note that reputation is generalized to the entire group. So individual NPCs might hold differing opinions. So if you had a particular group that you were liked or admired by, but you did something maybe on, just on the street to an individual member of that particular sect, of that particular group, that individual might not like you very much at all. However, that wouldn't necessarily affect the whole entire group. Let's get into the categories themselves. Once again, starting out with ignored, we're going to go middle and go towards a good. And then after we go all the way through the good, we'll go all the way through the bad. Now, ignored, the PCs, the player characters, are either unknown to this group or the group is largely indifferent towards them, kind of like that supermarket example. This is the typical starting point for most player characters with most groups, and it doesn't offer any particular advantages or disadvantages. You really aren't going to get anything from this, and in this case, when you're ignored, your reputation points can be anywhere from -4 to +4. You can raise your standing by any category of favor, and you can lower your standing by any sort of disservice. Now we're going to go ahead and start going towards the liked category. The liked category is from 5 to 14 reputation points. And once you're here, you can only raise higher by doing moderate or major favors. So minor favors wouldn't necessarily raise you anymore. However, you can still be lowered by any disservice. When you are liked, the player characters have managed to earn favor from the particular group. Many members of the group are aware of the player characters and generally hold a friendly disposition towards them. So even if they hadn't specifically met you before, if you met them on the street and you recognize them, they would immediately act friendly towards you, or at least not act unfriendly towards you. At this reputation level, only moderate and major favors result in the accumulation of reputation points. And you can kind of think of that this way, at least this is how I think of it, is if you already are a friend of someone and you do something like hand them a tissue when they sneeze, it's not necessarily that it's expected, but in truth, it kind of is. That is something you do because they are your friend. So the minor favor wouldn't grant you additional. You need to do something higher in order to get to a higher category of favor. And because of that, impressing the group requires more substantial efforts. The next category would be admired. So the player characters have gained the admiration of this group. The majority of the group members are acquainted with the player characters and hold an extremely favorable opinion of them. So in this case, you will more than likely be familiar to anyone in that group were you to run into them on the street. You specifically as a player character might not recognize the individual members, but the individual members of that particular group would more than likely recognize you. Many members actively assist the player characters, and even those who don't are still friendly. Once you get to this level, only major favors contribute to the accumulation of reputation points, as the group holds the player characters in high regard anyways, so you would need to do something more in order to raise it. And then we get to the highest level, which is revered. Revered would be from 30 to 50 reputation points, can be raised by a major favor, and can be lowered by moderate or major disservice. So the minor disservice generally isn't going to lower you out of this category. Once you hit revered, the group holds the player characters in the utmost reverence, considering them as heroic figures and celebrities. So you are more than likely to be, or to actually get awe from the people you meet with, who are part of that group, who hold you in a revered status. Every member of the group is familiar with the player characters, and they willingly provide assistance, even at great personal risk. At this level of reputation, only major favors contribute to the accumulation of reputation points, reflecting the high regard that the group has for the player characters. So you are expected to do good things. So in order to go higher, you basically need to go above and beyond. Additionally, only moderate or major disservices has the potential to diminish the earned reputation points. So this does kind of, once you get to this level, you're buffered from the minor disservice, basically. So now that we've talked about the good and the best you can get, which is revered, let's talk about the bad. This would basically start out with disliked. In disliked, the player characters possess an unfavorable reputation among the members of whatever group you're trying to do things with. Your reputation points are going to be -5 to -14. Any favor can increase your reputation, and moderate or major disservice are going to be the things that could lower your reputation. Minor disservices really won't lower your reputation because they are already have a disliked condition towards you, so they would expect minor disservice. Many individuals in the group are going to be aware of the player character's existence and will tend to be unfriendly toward them simply because they kind of think you're jerks. So they're going to, if they were to see you on the street, they basically say, oh, it's that jerk. The next category we'll go to is hated. Hated is going to be from -15 to -29, and pretty much any favor would increase your reputation, and only major disservices would decrease your reputation at this point. So the player characters have managed to incur a deep-seated animosity of whatever group this reputation category would hold. The vast majority of its members do know who you are, and they hold an extremely negative opinion of you. Many individuals within the group will display hostility towards the player characters, And even those who aren't hostile towards the player characters are going to be, at the very least, unfriendly. And if they are given any opportunity to potentially harm the player characters, they're going to seize on that. The last one is kind of a very hard one to get into, actually, and that would be hunted. Hunted would be a -30 to -50 reputation points. The only thing that can increase your reputation would be moderate or major favors. And the only thing that could decrease your reputation here would be a major disservice. Hated, the group actively pursues the player characters as targets or arch enemies, willing to bear significant cost to the group in the process. Every member of the group is familiar with the player characters, and they all harbor a very hostile attitude towards all the player characters. They are prepared to undertake substantial risks in order to hinder or to eliminate the player characters. Now, as mentioned, only major disservices could reduce your reputation points here because they already expect the worst of you. So it'd be pretty hard to go lower. And minor favors would almost be seen as you taking pity on them or something along those lines. So only moderate or major favors would increase your reputation with these groups once you have hit the hunted level. Now let's talk a little bit about running the optional reputation subsystem. So incorporating reputation points as a behind-the-scenes mechanism enables you to monitor the standing of the player characters with various groups, factions, churches, governments, basically in your campaign, and it is totally based on the actions and choices the player characters make. I kind of said this at the beginning, and I'll say it again. I honestly feel that of all the optional rules subsystems, this one is probably one of the easiest to implement. It makes the most sense. It is not situational at all, unless you are running a campaign where the player characters don't have a standard base of operations. If they don't, then that would be a hard one to run. However, in most cases, you could run a reputation system in any base city or base that the player characters would be running from. And I can see this really working with the Thieves Guild or working with the townsfolk if you wanted to run something like a secondary group, a secondary adventuring group that is full of NPCs. However, your player characters and this NPC group could kind of fight for favor within a particular city. I think it'd be an interesting side thing to do in a campaign, and it requires the least amount of GM work, I would think, of any of the optional subsystems. And the player characters already do a lot of these things anyways as they're running a campaign, so I could see it very easy to implement. So this does become valuable in a sandbox campaign or any campaign with a lot of structure in it and a lot of organizations in it. It assists in establishing kind of a reactive framework and tracking the player characters' relationships with the group they interact with. But there's one thing to keep in mind that would make this a little bit more difficult, in truth, is if you are running an adventure path where I can think of one, and we'll say Abomination Vaults, and you're working with Otari. If the players became hunted in Otari, well, then Abomination Vaults would be pretty hard to run. Because where would the player characters go? Why would they even want to defend Atari? A whole bunch of other things, that could come involved. So you wouldn't want the reputation system to derail the campaign. So one thing to keep in mind is that the point totals could not align with the narrative of the story. And if that's the case, it might be smart to do something along the lines of the example that's in this particular chapter, and I'll go ahead and just read the example. If the player characters are being pursued by the town guard due to a corrupt mayor, so they have a hunted status with the mayor and the local government, in order to kind of shift that narrative, they could subsequently embark on a major quest that unveils the mayor's misconduct to the town and therefore saving the town. Their reputation could drastically shift from extremely negative to significantly positive. And you could kind of go the other way. If you had a particular scenario where the player characters needed to not be friendly with a particular group, but for some reason they were at a high likability level, you could have the player characters' foes falsely implicate the player characters in some type of scheme or some kind of machination, and that would tarnish their reputation despite the lack of any actual disservice. So there are things that you can do in order to greatly shift the reputation of the player characters if where they are going doesn't fit with the narrative. It's a little bit of a scheme that you're doing a little bit behind the scenes. However, I think it could potentially add a lot of flavor and a lot of background to an otherwise maybe empty feeling campaign or a very bland feeling base of operations. So I really do enjoy this subsystem. Now, I hope this video on the reputation optional subsystem kind of helped you out. I really do like this one, and I really, honest to God, feel that this is one of the easiest optional rules subsystems to implement. It is something that the player characters are already going to be doing, and all you as the GM would be doing is just tracking the things that they're currently doing on the side. I'm not saying it's more work, because it is a little bit more work, but of the optional subsystems, I think it's the least amount of work that can add a lot to the narrative of the story. I do hope you like this video, and if you did, feel free to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, but whatever you do, I hope you have a great day and happy adventuring. Thanks.